taxes. And I would have told her, and then we would have moved right along, right? But she probably figured maybe he'll know the answer to this question, you know? So she says, why is this neighborhood pretty much all black? Now, her sister, who was 12 and a half at the time, does what an older sister does, right? Because the older sibling has to show how much they know. And they have to show off in front of the parent too. That's what older siblings do, right? And so Ashton, the 12 and a half year old, before I could even answer the question, before I could even really take in the magnitude of the question, she jumps in, she says, redlining, which was scary accurate. Yeah. Right? For those who know what that word means, you might wonder how this 12 and a half year old knew that. Well, see, I probably mumbled it in my sleep and she heard it, and you know, I don't know how she used it accurately in a sentence or a concept. It was completely contextually on point. And Rachel, the younger daughter, said, yeah, I don't know what redlining means. And I said, yeah, neither does she. She's just showing off. She just happened to get lucky, right? For those of you who aren't clear on the terminology, let's reflect and let's recall that redlining is, in fact, the practice that for generations was not only practiced, but quite legal until 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. And even after the Fair Housing Act, housing discrimination, including redlining, continued in a de facto sense. It was literally a practice whereby banks, right, would have maps on the wall. They would take big red markers and they would essentially outline the contours of black communities, occasionally Puerto Rican communities as well, occasionally working class white communities, but not usually. Usually black and brown spaces, and anybody who lived within the boundaries of the red line wasn't getting a loan, not a mortgage loan, not a business loan, not an equity loan, nothing. And it was perfectly legal for most of the time that it was done. And it resulted in certain people living certain places and other people not living in those spaces. So when my daughter used that word, even though she might not have understood it, it gave me the opportunity to explain both to her and to her sister how that neighborhood came to look the way it did. And I explained to them, for instance, that it wasn't just redlining, it was the fact, keep in mind, public housing in this country was created for poor white people. Let us be very clear. Initially, poor black and brown folk weren't even allowed to move into it. It was for poor white folks, right? But it just so happens that at the very same time that the government created public subsidized housing for white folks, it also created some other things for white folks, like FHA loans and VA loans and later the GI Bill, which allowed the very same families that maybe initially had lived in public housing and others that lived in working class white communities to be able to hustle it out of those spaces into the suburbs where only we were allowed to live. People of color then moving in behind white folks, not allowed to move to the suburbs, rarely able to access those FHA loans, at least not for the first 30 to 35 years of their existence. Less than 2% of the FHA loans given out between 1934 and 1962 went to anyone that wasn't white, because they had underwriting rules that basically said you couldn't get a government underwritten loan if giving it to you would change the homogeneity of the neighborhood, which meant black and brown folks weren't getting loans to live around white people. And they also had a rule that said you couldn't get an FHA loan if you lived in a neighborhood that was of declining quality, and every black neighborhood was considered of declining quality. So this was just a way of essentially institutionalizing housing segregation and inequality. And of course, by the 1950s, the government was creating the interstate highway program, which amounted to a huge subsidy for white folks to leave cities, right? I mean, you know, it's not how we sell it today, right? We celebrate the interstate highway program as this way that you could go visit your Aunt Polly, who lived out in the country, right? And we talk about how it helps get goods to market and it helped, you know, grease the skids of the economy, and all of that may be true, but what it really did was it allowed white folks, and pretty much only white folks, to leave the cities, made it cheaper to do so, making it easier, quicker, more affordable, right? So in a sense, it was really a way for the government to subsidize white flight. And they left behind folks of color who now were living in urban areas that were in all but name concentration camps. Let us be very clear, right? Because if folks are not allowed to leave, not allowed to live elsewhere, the fact that you don't have a fence around it, right, doesn't really change what it is, right? And so I explained that to my daughters. It took about 3 minutes and we were good. Now they have an understanding. Why was that important? Well, it's very important because we live in a culture that basically says something very different. And if I don't explain, if I don't know the answer to my daughter's question, right, because maybe I haven't studied it or maybe I haven't been taught it myself. How many of us haven't? Can't teach what you don't know. If you haven't been taught, if I haven't been taught, and then your daughter, your son, my son, a friend, a kid in your classroom, if you're a classroom teacher, asks you that question and you don't know what to say, do you think that means they stop wondering? No, they keep wondering, But they are going to come up with the only other answer they possibly can. What do you think that answer is? It's the one that the culture transmits every day, and it transmits it to every one of us. What is the one thing that every single one of us in this room, regardless of racial background, ethnic, cultural background, religious background, socioeconomic status, geographic place of origin, has been taught in one way or another by this culture? Doesn't mean we've all accepted it to the same extent, but we've all been hit over the head with it. What is the one lesson that we all got, either by our parents, if not our parents, by our teachers, if not our teachers, our preachers, if not our preachers, politicians, if not politicians, just the regular day-to-day working of the way that the air circulates in this country? That one lesson we all got hit with was what? Wherever you end up, it's on you, right? If you work hard enough, you can make it. And if you didn't make it, it's because you didn't try hard enough. That is the secular gospel of America. Right? It's the creation myth of America. If you made it, it's because you're the best. If you didn't make it, it's on you, something wrong with you. Now, on the one hand, I understand why we teach our children this, right? Like I said, I have 2 daughters. Don't think for 1 minute that my wife and I don't tell them that they can be anything they want if they're willing to work hard. But you see, we change it up a little bit. We put an asterisk at the end of that statement, right? The asterisk that brings you down to the bottom of the page and says, it's a little more complicated than that. Right? Here's a little footnote, right? For that thing that Daddy just told you to be true, that you can be anything you want, if you just work hard enough, you're going to have to do more than just work hard as individual human beings. You're going to have to realize, for instance, dear daughters, that as women, there will be men, and sadly, even some other women, who will think of you as lesser because you are women. So, in order for you to really be everything that you're capable of being, you're not just going to have to work hard as individuals. You're going to have to work hard collectively with other women and with male allies to smash the system of sexism, patriarchy, and misogyny in this country that seeks to hold women back. Now, the culture does not believe in the asterisk. This society, our politicians, our educators, our leaders, by and large, don't want to put the asterisk. In fact, when I tell some parents that I put the asterisk, they look at me like I've lost my mind. Only white parents. People of color are very clear about this.
Right.
People of color understand that the asterisk is essential to raising their own children. Right? But other white parents will look at me and, well, my goodness. Why do you tell you're going to create a victim mentality? You're going to turn them into permanent victims. Right? What am I really doing? I'm trying to prepare my children for the way the world actually is. Not the way the world I'd like it to be. If I didn't do that, it'd be like sending my daughters down a dark alley. And I just so happen to know there's an electric fence at the end of the alley and it's turned on. But I don't want to tell them because I wouldn't want to freak them out. No, just go. Really, it's okay, just run. I know it's dark, it's scary, I know there's a fence. Electric? I don't know, what do I know? Just run. And then it zaps them and they're like, Dad, the fence? And what am I supposed to say? Well, I didn't want to make you neurotic, you know. Right? That would make me a piss poor father, right? The reality is we have to be honest. We have to prepare our young people, because if we don't, the culture fills in the blanks. And my children, if I don't tell them that little history, I didn't go into like a PhD level dissertation. I didn't tell them to read, you know, the book American Apartheid by Massey and Denton, which explains all this stuff real well. We'll get to that like next week I'll make them read that. But they were 10 and a half and 12 and a half. It was a little early. Right? But I gave them the 3-minute thumbnail sketch version. If I don't, they will default to the myth of meritocracy, and they will say, well, the reason these people are living in these conditions, because they can see from the infrastructure of the community that it's a poor neighborhood, right? The reason that they live there and we don't is because they are lesser and we are better, we are smarter, we have worked harder, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? That'll be the default position, which is the scary thing about this country and this culture, is that you don't have to actually be taught racism to be taught racism. Right. You understand? Like, there used to be this saying, there was a group for years, NCCJ, National Conference of Christians and Jews. Later on it became the National Council for Community Justice, I think was the name of it. Right? And they had a slogan back in the day. It was, you have to be taught how to hate, which was a sort of a riff on an old South Pacific song from the musical South Pacific. Right? And on the one hand, there may be some truth to that. It certainly helps if you have a parent that sits you down and teaches you who to hate. I suppose it makes it easier. But the point is, this is the sick thing. You don't have to be taught how to hate to come to conclusions that are hateful. Because if the culture tells you wherever you end up is on you, and then you look around and you see some folk up here and some folk down here, and the folks up here disproportionately look one way, and the folk down here disproportionately look another way, you don't have to be taught hatred. You could grow up in a nice